right. Oh, that is on. I grabbed this one because I'm just going to slightly get out of that light a little bit. I hope that's okay with everybody. Once again, I hope everybody's awake. I'll make this as interesting as possible, I hope, to close out the event. I'm not going to lie, though. It's a humbling experience to follow some of those talks today. I think a lot of the kids and the adults, but really the kids stood out to me today as really nailing some of those topics, and makes me even more passionate to deliver this because that's what we're here to do, is to support and to help them. So this topic was a bit of a fun one created for this event. It's not off the repertoire, so to speak. And the name's a bit of a tease, but we'll get to that in a second. So I'd rather sign a cast because I can't sign an anxiety disorder. So the inspiration for this quote, now some of the play workers in the room will recognise this very, very famous woman if you're a play worker. Unfortunately, not always if you are not. But the photo on the screen there is of one Lady Marjorie Allen. Lady Marjorie was an absolute amazing pioneer in children's rights right back in the era of World War II, when unfortunately, for lots of other compounding reasons, the pledges and the rights of children were not always at the front of consideration with a lot of other stuff going on. Now, Lady Allen famously made that quote, which is better a broken bone than a broken spirit, which was very contextual to the time that she was working with children, mostly in the UK, in the bombed out buildings, in the rubble, in the very first adventure playgrounds that we had in the world. Now, play workers have adapted that quote. They've used it for many, many, many years. And obviously it's not meant to be a throwaway comment about actually accepting broken bones. It's meant to balance that idea with something equally or even possibly more important, and that is one's spirit. But the question comes up because of photos just like this, these beautiful old photos of Lady Allen at work in the field. What's the relevance? You know, we're talking about children in World War II, clearly a very potentially traumatic time to live, and that statement is contextual to that time, different expectations, different understandings of risk and risk provision. But I've been asked that so many times, and all I can turn around to say to that is, well, sure, because we don't have any mental health or anxiety or depression or suicide in our youth today, do we? With a big question mark, because those things are still contextual, as contextual potentially, maybe more than ever. So this statement resonates with me, hence the play around with that idea to the name of the talk. Now, to be clear, I realise that the name of the topic was a bit facetious. I've even put the definition of facetious there because I thought that would be quite enjoyable, treating serious issues with deliberately inappropriate humour. A facetious topic for a serious thing. But I'm going to convince you by the end that I'm definitely not treating this facetiously, so to speak. As a play worker, I can tell you right now, there's a whole bunch of amazing play workers up on the stage right then. We do work in realms that appear to be, I'm going to use inverted commas, risky, but we don't want injuries. In fact, we actively work towards avoiding those things, but we do this in tandem with something else. Playwork principle number 8, for those that are not familiar with the principles, there is only 8. So if you would like to read the rest of them, you can look them up, but this is the 8th and final one. Clearly states that playworkers choose an intervention style that enables children and young people to extend their play. All playworker intervention must balance risk with the developmental benefit and well-being of the children. We balance the risk. Now, the reason I am being cheeky today by calling out the powers that be and how risk is often dealt with is that we as play workers balance the risk, whereas a lot of risk provision only focuses on the risk itself, which omits tremendous potential benefit and opportunity and developmental progression for children when understood well. Now, introductions and some background and biases, because I have to confess my own biases, so this session makes more sense. And all the kids got to do it, so I want to do it as well. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my childhood. So that's a photo of myself when I was about 7 or 8 in the western suburbs in Brisbane. Now, my parents were a family that used to habitually renovate homes, sell, move, renovate, move, sell, so on and so forth. So by the time I was 15, I'd lived in about 13 houses. What that meant was that for me, my average backyard or living environment at the time was just full of stuff. And that stuff was movable and changeable, and there was always tools around, and my dad was pretty handy, so generally speaking, like in the photo, if there was a tree in the backyard, he'd put those 4 telephone poles in the ground and leave the rest up to us. And we'd build a frame, build a scaffold, make tree houses, manipulate the environment, and have a lot of fun doing it. The funny part and the important part for me at the time was I just thought that's what you do. Like I didn't perceive that as being unusual or extraordinary. It's just what we did. There's a lot of names for this now. Loose parts play, risky play, outdoor play, nature play. We used to just call it play, which resonates with me a lot now, is like the things that we don't always offer children. But that's how I grew up. Now that was an important story because for a long, long time I went away from being a child and I had several careers and so on and so forth. But when I landed myself back in a situation where I was working with children, then I realised how incredible and what an amazing experience in childhood this was, because the children, when I first started working in the space that I was working, were not only not allowed to do stuff like this, but I'm talking like cartwheels getting banned kind of level of risk provision and risk management. And I promise you, as someone that worked very closely and got to know these children for a long time, because I worked at that space for 15 years, it was not balanced. Maybe there was no cartwheels and as such no grazed knees, but there was a lot of benefits lost as a result. Now, that seems fairly flippant of me because I'm not talking about hectic risks, so I do want to also share something with you, and I am a parent myself. These are my 2 little children getting a cameo today. They are 7 and 8 years old, so I appreciate and understand and can also see through the lens of a parent and a carer, and I think that is important to clarify. I'm not sure if you've ever been in a lecture with an adult speaking about child development and risk and so on and so forth that is not a parent. I don't know, it doesn't sell as well sometimes anyway. So I just did want to share this. And I do live through my mantra with my children and believe they've both developed into incredibly resilient, beautiful, adventurous children with a healthy amount of risk detection and self-management of these things as a result, which is important. And this is their beautiful creek kindy that was around the corner from where we lived at the time. So the balance. Now this is the important part. This is the crux that if we don't take anything else away today, I really want to emphasize the import of this balance and interplay. So despite a large portion of the paperwork, and I work with dozens and dozens of schools across Southeast Queensland and Queensland, kindergartens, OSHAs, you name it, when given risk management documentation, you will find that 95 or more, sometimes 100% of that paperwork is completely predicated around physical injury. And I'm not suggesting that's a terrible thing. I do not, once again, I will say, want children to be hurt. However, it suggests that that's the only type of risk that you would need to consider in these spaces where children grow, develop, thrive, interact with other children, and take on all these other experiences. It is why, and Penny, thank you, you did mention this, and it actually jogged my memory to maybe mention this, it is actually why I use a process of risk-benefit analysis as opposed to traditional risk management, as many other people in the room might do. Because in the benefits column, you can build in all of these other social, emotional, and cognitive things into that same paperwork and not just focus on the physical. Now, the danger of only focusing on the physical, as I said, is that you just miss stuff. And I'm going to tell you right up, and I'm sure anyone will actually realise this makes perfect sense when I say it, most of the risks that children will engage in throughout their formative years, from kindy through to primary school, isn't physical. There's some of that, but most of it by far is social risks, emotional risks, cognitive risks. Most children who do things like abscond from school or don't go in the first place are not doing it out of fear of physical risk. They're doing it out of fear of social and emotional and cognitive challenges, despair, unable to deal with that because they haven't been given the toolkit to do so. So these need to be thought about. More importantly though, these things don't happen in isolation. So to manage them as if they were in isolation is foolhardy. What I mean by that, when we undertake some form of physical risk, make no mistake, we are testing ourselves. We are growing and developing social, emotional, cognitive capabilities that lead us to be successful human beings. What do you think it means for those developmental benefits if we remove the thing that's actually creating those in the first place? Because they're not in isolation. They're greatly, greatly overlapping and all happening at the same time. So stories and examples. I wanted to keep you awake with some stories. I know that joke's going to get old soon, but it is that time of day. So some stories and examples of exactly what I mean. And what I mean by what I mean is I want to demonstrate to you this interplay. And I want you then to go away and reflect, because everyone would have been through experiences like these or had their children go through experiences like these. So the first story, our friend the wrestler, there's two. So our friend the wrestler, a long time ago now, where I was working, which is a place called Camp Hill outside of School Hours Care. Some of you may have heard of it. It's got a decent social media presence. I worked there for just over 15 years, and it was some of the best 15 years of my life, quite literally. The things that we saw and experienced and were able to create there still resonate with me to this day. But we had this boy, and he was a boy that when he came to us, he'd been through some very, very, I get a bit choked up telling this story, in the beginning, but he had been through some very, very excessive trauma. He had seen and been on the butt end of things that a child just shouldn't ever know about for a lot longer in their lives, but he'd been there. That was his life. That was his lived experience, and it had shaped and scarred him to a degree. But when he came to us, he was very, very challenging, and I mean that not negatively. It's just challenging, and we rise to challenges, so that's fine. But the reality was that he was quite challenging, to the point that for a long, long, long time, we had one-on-one care provision for him. He needed that level of support because his rises into aggressive situations were rapid and serious, because he was very, very wired that way. Now, interesting there, and this is a fun one to take away for your own teams and lives and dialogue that you have with people. A lot of people used to describe him as going from 1 to 10 really, really quickly, which sort of made sense to me at the time until I learned that children who have experienced extreme trauma, they don't go from 1 to 10 because they live in 8. So the difference between going from 1 to 10 and that seeming fast, wow, you should see someone go from 8 to 10. It's a very quick leap. It doesn't always manifest as that because they're holding it together, but going from 8 to 10 happens quickly, not 1 to 10. And in trauma-informed practice, that's why with children who exist in 1 to 3, we can have a more relaxed approach. But children that live in 8, we're constantly actually proactively working towards lowering that number, as opposed to just accepting that at some point it might jump up. Anyway, that's a small tangent, but I thought maybe of interest for people working in that space. So our young friend had an interesting history with us, but it was mostly positive, and therefore he wasn't kicked out, which was something that he'd been very, very also privy to in all the other places that he'd bounced around. Now, I can't bridge a 3-year story, but what I will tell you is that after 3 years, he was starting to get very, very interested in rough and tumble play. And this was after a lot of solo play, a lot of adult and child play, a lot of support in that space. And one day he was rough and tumble playing, so quite literally wrestling. For those who are uncomfortable with that, I apologise, but it is a play type with a lot of benefits. But he was rough and tumble playing with a group of children in his own grade. And one of my play workers came to me and said, "Angus, I'm not sure what to do because it's him, I won't say any names, and I'm concerned that this is going to escalate." Being a more experienced play worker at the time, I stepped in and opted to take on the supervision of that, which is good practice between play workers. No one play works well when you're fully stressed and uncomfortable in a situation. That doesn't work well either. But took on the role of supervising that because what I saw was, yes, a risk that I was now responsible for and could manage, but I saw this boy playing with peers for nearly the first time ever in his 3 years with us. And I saw that as a benefit that far exceeded the manageable risk that I could support in that time. And that's that interplay, that's that overlap. That is me accepting the management of that risky situation because the social and emotional benefits for this unique particular child far exceed. Long story short, guess who ended up over the next few months becoming his peer group, his friends, and the guys that he still gets around with today as a group of peers? It was those children. So what can scare people, rough and tumble, it does do it, is where oxytocin's happening, it's where bonding's occurring, it's where all this phenomenal mammal stuff happens if we understand the interplay and not just the, someone could get an ouch and that's bad, so stop. Sorry, there's the facetious bit again, right? But here we are. The next one, our friend the jumper. This is a fun one because heights scare people as well. But I was working at a kindergarten in the North Pine region, won't say exactly where, and we had this young lad who commenced care in this particular service about halfway through the year. It was an awkward time for him because peer groups had been formed, friendships and bond groups were already there. It's not a great time to start when you're already having a few other things going on with audio processing and you're struggling to issue language and joining in play frames and so on and so forth. But this kid was also the kind of kid that went to the farm every weekend and drove a Pee-wee 50 motorbike. His physical competency was high, despite having some deficits in other areas. Now, the kindergarten put in this new playground, which was a very interesting one. It was a huge wooden dome that, quite frankly, someone that understands the Australian playground standards very well, not completely sure how it was compliant because it was not on softball, but it was this huge wooden dome, and the idea of the dome was that you could attach ropes to it, chuck tarps over it. Like, it was very, very versatile. I quite liked it, actually, as a play structure for its versatility and adaptability. It wasn't one thing. It could be many. Not quite a loose part, but in that same sort of vein. Anyway, first thing that happened though when they opened the playground was this young lad went straight to the top and jumped. And he landed on the grass, performed a nice little roll. Connor, you would have been proud, I think, if he's still here. A very, very good tumbler. And he got back up and did it again. No problems whatsoever because his physical capability was far in excess of others. The problem was, and for those that work in childcare centres or kindergartens or OSHAs, you'll appreciate this, what do you think every other child, particularly, surprise, surprise, the boys, wanted to do after witnessing this child jump off the top of the frame? Join in, absolutely. So then the educators were in a dilemma. How do we support this? Quick phone call later, because we're in a mentoring situation at the time, and they had some decisions to make. Interestingly enough, these situations actually have a funny way of ironing themselves out, because what actually did happen with the first few boys that got up is they went up to the top with this lad and kind of looked down and went, oh no, and then went down a few layers. On the way the frame was designed, there was different levels and so on and so forth. Risk is a pretty powerful and obvious thing sometimes if we let it be. Sugarcoating and cushioning and bubble wrapping playgrounds can actually erode that. Do you know why? That's why children in the safest playgrounds in the world approach those places more recklessly than they do with playgrounds that we deliberately show them that there's a risk that they can engage with and make decisions about. However, I digress. So it wasn't a huge problem, but they still decided to reflect on this and they pulled out this giant high jump mat out of the shed. And it was a classic resource, one of those things that had been there for 10 years. They didn't have a purpose for it until now. And they dragged that thing out and put it underneath the frame. Anyway, other boys started jumping off onto the mat, not our friend who continued doing it onto the grass, and that was fine. But I had another really excited phone call about 2 weeks later where the jumping had stopped. And now there were just 5 boys sitting at the top of the frame, chilling out. Because that's why we like to climb, right? It's not usually about the jumping, it's just about being up. We do it as adults. We walk up to lookouts and gaze out at the view. There's nothing else there. It's just that idea of being high with perception. It's a powerful thing for our psyche. So after another couple of weeks, I had even a more beautiful phone call, and that group who'd been sitting up talking, bantering, or just being on top of this frame had worked into the classroom and they were now doing tabletop activities together. Thank you, Hayano. doing tabletop activities together. So none of that social interaction or that benefit for that child would have existed if it wasn't for the fact that that boy could show himself, his capabilities and his skills in the way that he did in that playground. So data, how do we stop this? What are we doing wrong at the moment? Well, this is pretty damning here, but the 2023 health poll showed that we're playing outside physically, rigorously, less than we ever have, despite the benefits. And that's mostly because of lack of time to supervise, safety fears, and the lure of screens. Now that's a problem because, Dun, 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 exactly. My clicker's not working, I apologise. Would you mind doing that manually for me? Thank you. Physical activity has been shown to be important for children's immediate social, mental, physical health, as well as protective health across their entire lifespan. Now imagine those little knee-jerky things we're doing to make it convenient for us in a little moment that potentially go on to have negative impacts across an entire lifespan. That scares me. That makes me want to balance it. It doesn't want to make me provision reckless risk for children, but it does make me want to think about it and how to weigh that and how to scale that. Time spent outdoors is the most consistent predicator of children's physical activity. So once again, more time out, more time engaging in this stuff, and it pushes back. Oh, I've got another clicker coming though, but I've probably got like 1 minute. All right. So the risk paradox is one of the things I'll quickly close with. And this is just the idea that society unwittingly, because it's benign, it's not usually deliberate, we actually imbalance what is really a risk versus what we perceive as a risk. And it's usually because of our experiences, our background, our culture, what we did or didn't do as children. But in a really good care or play setting, we can't be benign about that. We have to be aware and deliberate about it, or we can lose really good opportunities for children. The most obvious example of the risk paradox for me is, as probably no surprises, I work in a lot of loose parts playgrounds, and despite the scrutiny we get on those because of what they look like, guess where more broken bones in every single school that I work in happen? The fixed metal playground. The certified, approved, expensive playground in the school, but they are rarely under any scrutiny. Because the paradox applies, and they're the things that we have been shown that are playgrounds, if that makes sense. No. So, calling out the bureaucracy and tick boxes. I'm going to make this one loud and proud because it's so true at the moment. And 1 minute to go. Perfect, Hannah. That'll do just nicely. This is my bugbear, because when people actually knee-jerk risk because they genuinely and authentically do not want children to get hurt, fair, right? Like, I get that. I don't want it either, but we can have a conversation about benefits. The problem is, too many of these decisions are not being made by those people. They're being made by bureaucrats who want to tick boxes, remove liability, and so on and so forth. I know that sounds far-fetched, but I'll give you a perfect example. Any single state school I sign into, this is what it looks like. I go through the front door, I go in and I've got a 38-page induction thing that comes up on the screen that I've got to sign. And they're like, just go to the bottom and sign. All the information that I'm meant to know to be safe and compliant and responsible on that site has been designed by these people to remove that. It doesn't really matter, does it? Because I skim, sign. Now that's facetious, but these are the same people who are preventing incredible opportunities for children, removing these benefits, and then actually not really caring at the end of the day. Last slide. So I'm going to go past that one, sorry, besides the cool picture. And not to conclude it, I want to leave you with a quote, which is this one. Now, this is going to be something that I chose today. Bob Hughes is one of my favourite playwork theorists because this really, for me, wraps up the Childhood Summit, in my opinion. This is a quote from Evolutionary Playwork, and I'm going to read it verbatim because I think it's important. But in the future, we may look back and see this as a period of missed opportunity. The problem, though, is that it has always been a human failing not to see the wood for the trees, and that blindness, that our salvation, our resistance to extinction, lies in the child's world and not the adults, may be what marks us out as unable, perhaps incapable of resisting the pressures of extinction in the end. Now, Bob is basically saying that it's what happens in childhood that leads us to be successful human animals that is advancing, evolving and progressing and not becoming redundant. What does that mean if our society consistently removes childhood, erodes childhood, undermines childhood? What does that cost us as a society, as a species in the long run? Thank you very much.